We are back. It's the Infowarrior with Jason Bermas. I am joined by Webster Tarpley, and I want to shift gears a little bit. I want to get your take, Webster, on all these headlines now admitting the death of the dollar, including the Washington Times, the Independent, Reuters is reporting it. There are also some reports out there that the oil-rich nations are going to be shifting away from the dollar and into the euro. I want to get your take on that. Why are they coming out and announcing it at this point?
Well, I think there are a number of things happening. It is certainly true in a general historical sense that the dominion of the dollar as the sole reserve currency of the world is now obsolete and has to be brought to an end. But the big question is how. This can be done in a chaotic way, which leads to a world catastrophe. The bottom can fall out all over the world, thanks to the fact that we have these derivatives. Or it can be done in an orderly and positive way if it's based on negotiation. Now, the problems with negotiation are obviously the Obama regime, which has got this guy Geithner, who's on the phone every day. Geithner is on the phone with Blankfein of Goldman Sachs, with Pandit the Bandit of Citibank, and with Diamond of J.P. Morgan Chase. And those are the people who tell Tiny Tim Geithner what to do. So these are not people who are going to be interested in negotiating. And Obama himself is, of course, as a Wall Street puppet, a tremendous barrier to this. But let's look a little bit beyond it, because something needs to be done. The problem you have in the middle of all this is the British. The British always play the role of treachery, wrecker. They're always trying to shift the consequences of the world economic depression, which they've taken a leading role in creating, especially through ideas and policies. And the role of Gordon Brown in this crisis has been, he's the guy who came up with the first bailouts, right? The U.S. was following in the wake of Gordon Brown. He's pursuing a typical British beggar my neighbor policy. It's always what the British have always done in the 1930s and today. You had this headline about London is now passing New York as the great financial center. That's their goal. That has always been their goal. In 2007, most recently, the British kept their interest rates very high, trying to attract hot money and pass New York. That led to the Northern Rock bankruptcy, because the British were simply too weak to do what they were trying to do. In 2008, you can make a very good case that the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers was helped along decisively by the British during that famous Lehman Brothers weekend on the 12th and 13th and 14th of September last year. The people at the New York Fed were looking for a buyer for Lehman Brothers in the same way that Bear Stearns had been bought by J.P. Morgan Chase back in March. And the buyer that emerged was Barclays Bank of Great Britain. And this seemed to be the working hypothesis all through Saturday, Sunday, until about 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday, when the word came that the British regulators, who are people you never hear from, they're the weakest of all regulators really anywhere in the world, they said, no, we're blocking this sale. And this meant that it was so late in the day, there was no opportunity to come up with an alternative. You didn't have time to organize somebody else to buy it, and Japan was about to open, so at that point they simply had to have protection from the creditors. So in a way, Gordon Brown and this British policy of treachery and beggar my neighbor was one of the reasons we got into this in the first place. The general idea is that when there's a depression, the British try to use it, in this case was to bring down the dollar, to bring down the euro if they could do that, and let the pound reassert itself and the city of London as the financial center of the world. Now, that's why it's interesting. This report on the international operation to replace the dollar as the currency for the posted price of oil. This comes from this guy, Robert Fisk of the London Independent. Mm-hmm. And this is a British intelligence figure who's been sitting in Beirut for these many years. And he writes interesting things about the Middle East. He's a great critic of the U.S. policy in Iraq and in Afghanistan and vis-a-vis Iran and all these other things. it's very easy to be anti-American when you have, mad dog regimes like we've had. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you will find that there is a particularly venomous kind of British anti-Americanism. This is the resentment, the hatred of the washed-up empire. In other words, the has-beens of the imperial world trying to reassert themselves. And I think that's what's coming. If you look at this television network, Al Jazeera, they've also been pushing the Fisk analysis. And the idea there is these are, it's mainly run by the British. The English language version of Al Jazeera featuring Fisk is totally dominated by British who are foaming at the mouth against the U.S. And again, from my point of view, they do it for all the wrong reasons. So let's focus on that first of all. Mm-hmm. The idea would be now, the article alleges that we've got Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Oman, the Gulf Arabs, in other words, that are teaming up perhaps with maybe France, according to some versions, and maybe Japan, in changing from the dollar to something else for the price of oil. Now, up to a certain point, this is fine. Iran has just done this. Iran has now shifted to pretty much overwhelming use of the euro, and that they've been doing that for a while. The question now is, if you simply remove the dollar from the picture in a very brusque and kind of unilateral way, you will collapse the dollar. I think the people who were writing about this, some of them don't realize how vulnerable and fragile the dollar is. The British do, but some of these others may not, like the Chinese. The Chinese are sitting there with $1.5 trillion to $2 trillion. And if they do what they say they're planning to do, they will end up with nothing. In other words, once you start saying that the oil will no longer be priced in dollars, and that will be pretty much worldwide, the demand for dollars will significantly collapse, and the dollar will collapse, and you'll go into a catastrophic implosion of the entire U.S. economy. Now, they may think that can be limited to the United States. It can't be. This is why it's so important to do this in a concerted and negotiated way. It's the opposite of the British approach, which would be to try to collapse the U.S. as a matter of policy, and then if they can after that, collapse the European Union. In other words, the British are playing the dirtiest conceivable game of treachery with Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown, of course, is on his way out, right? He's finished, so he would like to crown his career with something horrendous like this.
In fact, all the headlines over at the Telegraph and the Guardian are hailing Cameron as the savior, and he's got this great plan. Continue.
Yeah, again, this imperialist urge, it's like Freddy, right? It keeps coming back, right? Like these horror movies that you see on TV around this time of year. Obviously, what you would need is a negotiated agreement to have a new world monetary system where the dollar would be joined by the euro, the yen, the ruble, a possible Arab regional currency, which has been in the works for quite a while, and indeed a Latin American regional currency. And if you could establish fixed parities among them, and if you could establish gold settlement among them, at least as a goal, then you would get to a stable system. The other thing, though, that you have to do, which these articles obviously don't talk about, you've got to relaunch world trade. One of the reasons currencies in general are in bad shape, right? When gold goes up to 1050 or 1055 against the dollar, 1055, that's a vote of confidence in all forms of paper, because the euro doesn't do very well either. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons is there's not enough demand for currency because world trade has collapsed by about 35 to 40% compared to last year, which means we're in a depression. If you simply tinker with money, you'll never get out of this. What you've got to do is find a way to vastly increase the exports of capital goods and indeed agricultural commodities out of the advanced countries towards the sub-Saharan Africa, Bangladesh, South Asia, and places like this. You've got to restart world trade. So it's not just a matter of, reestablishing money one way or another, tinkering with money. No, that won't do it. You can do that, but and you should. But it's got to have a goal. The British would never, of course, accept this because they have nothing. Their position is even worse than the U.S. because the U.S. at least still has quite a bit of farm production that we can sell. In terms of these dollars that are held by the Chinese or the Russians, I've tried to argue in favor of repatriating them. In other words, I would say to the Chinese, don't look at those dollars as a financial asset. If they're a financial asset, you are doomed one way or the other. Because if you hold them, they will dwindle. They're a wasting asset. They're going to go away. And if you dump them, then they dwindle even faster. So why don't you do something smart and buy things, make large purchases of capital goods in the United States or elsewhere, but in the United States is very good, to look at the things that the U.S. could still produce. The one thing that obviously comes to mind,